WCNC Charlotte, this is Flashpoint.
Thanks for joining us here on Flashpoint. I'm Ben Thompson. It is a big year ahead for Charlotte City leaders. City Council set to take up the Unified Development Ordinance. It's to guide how the city grows in the decades to come when it comes to things like development and zoning. There's still time for you to weigh in. We'll tell you how. And there's also transit and transportation. The Transformative Mobility Plan promises to be just that, transformative. We're talking rails and roads, trails, sidewalks, you name it. It would come with a proposed 1-cent sales tax to create revenue for the network. But it requires buy-in from stakeholders, city leaders, regional leaders, Raleigh, Washington. And we should say, all of this would have to happen in an election year. So all that means council members setting the agenda right now might not be there by year's end. Joining us today, Charlotte City Councilman Tariq Bokhari and Larken Egleston. City Council members, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it. Happy New Year, by the way, to both of you.
Good to see you.
All right, I'm going to ask you both the same open-ended question to begin here. What do you see as the priority for you and council, of course, headed into this new year? Tariq, I'll begin with you.
Well, there's a lot of priorities. And on one side, the first things that jump to mind are the huge ticket items we have to deal with. Obviously, public safety being up there, obviously the UDO and us rezoning the entire city being up there, and obviously transportation and the Transformational Mobility Network and whatever that ends up meaning, and then the election in general and what we're going to do. So there's a ton, but if I had to pick just one, I would say public safety has to be it. While we've seen some improvements in numbers, you know, we've seen some other numbers get worse, and this is not a game where you can look at any numbers at a point in time. So you have to be looking at it in a broader range of time, and there's still a lot of challenges around the public safety, crime, officer morale, and support areas that need to be my top focus.
And I want to get to some of those numbers coming up in just a second, because we do have those. They were released this past week. Larken, let me go ahead and get you your priority for the year.
Yeah, I mean, things like public safety and affordable housing are going to continue to be priorities every year because they're things that we've made great gains on, but that we're never done with the work. I think the things that are maybe going to be specifically unique to 2022 are, as Tariq mentioned, completing the UDO and working on this transformational mobility network. And that might be something that we don't see come to fruition in 2022 so much. Maybe it's 2023, but I think there's a lot of work to be done this year. So those two, I think, are the two that people ought to be keeping their eye on specifically this year.
We're always getting new viewers and people who might not always follow local politics. And you say UDO and you talk about Unified Development Ordinances. You're like, okay, it's talking about zoning, development, that sort of thing. Explain, for folks who want to catch up, why is this so important? And also, we should say, there's still plenty of time for public comment.
There is, and actually the public comment period just got extended to, I believe, March 18th. And so there's a lot more time for people to go in, get up to speed on what the Unified Development Ordinance is, weigh in with their feedback. But what it is it's bringing together plans, many of which are decades old, and it's bringing them together in one plan. It's making sure that they're speaking to each other and they're not in conflict with each other. We haven't updated our land use regulations and policies in a long time, other than in bits and pieces. And this is going to be one wholesale look at all of those things that guide the way that our city's built and what our city is going to look like in the future. So it is critically important. There are varying opinions on how that should be done. And we do want as much public input as we can get, which is why we've extended that comment period for folks.
Tariq, what is your concern when it comes to UDO? I know sort of the inspiration for a lot of this was the Charlotte 2040 plan we talked about last year at length. And you and others on council had some concerns about how this thing develops when it comes to UDO and some of your concerns.
Yeah, well, first of all, and most importantly, if you're a new listener on the show and you're learning about this for the first time, you pronounce it UDO for everyone that wants to know. So remember to do that when you're out in public. My largest kind of concern is how we did it last year with what led to this, the 2040 comp plan. If the UDO is, like Larken said, a bunch of the ordinances now being updated and coming together in a cohesive set, the 2040 comp plan was the vision statement and kind of, you know, the barometer, if you will, for that journey. So we did a lot of things that we could have done a lot better back then as it related to how we came to consensus, really, I think is number one. So in council earlier this week, I made a recommendation that ultimately we come up with 3 buckets per council member early on, transparently with each other, are, things that are nice to have, things that are really important, and things that ultimately, like, if we don't get solved, I'm a no vote. So that way staff can start working on those things. We can start debating them as a group, and it doesn't become like all right, let's do as much as we can, and then everyone decides at the last minute how they're going to vote. And I think that will play its way really importantly into the community's touch points, which is, this is a really complicated topic. So if you go to all the sites and you read up, it's going to be like looking at a new foreign language for most people. That's why I think what we really need community feedback on is when we get to those must-haves between council members, what does the community think about the really binary options when it comes down to the most controversial parts? Abolishing single-family zoning, using community benefit agreements, putting density in commercial areas where we really need it, ultimately through height and density, so we can get the number of ultimate units we're lacking.
I've been lucky enough to be reporting here in Charlotte for about 15 years now. I remember when I first got here, the Blue Line was just starting in my first year or two here. And it seems like ever since then, every year, transit is a big issue and a big story here in the Charlotte area. Why is this year a make or break year when it comes to transit and transportation?
Well, I think it's a big year because what we're talking about doing is making a big splash and doing a lot of stuff at once. What we've done, as you mentioned, was we create, the first half of the Blue Line. A decade later, we opened the second half of the Blue Line. These things have been done sort of one at a time, piecemeal. And what we want to do now is, as it's named, a Transformational Mobility Network. And it doesn't just mean expanding our rail system. It also means improving our roads. It also means connecting our sidewalk network, connecting our trail system, lots of things, and maybe most importantly, improving our bus service, improving the frequency of it, improving the quality of the buses on it, giving people options. We are a city we'll be a city of 1 million people in the not too distant future. And while in the past, having a bunch of single family houses on half-acre lots and having every single person driving by themselves in a single passenger vehicle might have worked for a city of 200,000 or 300,000 people, it's not working for a city of almost 900,000, soon to be 1 million people. And so we've got to give people options. We've got to give people alternatives to those types of things. It doesn't mean that those things don't exist any longer, but it does mean that people have options for alternatives. And so trying to do a lot of things at once and trying to do them with a lot of funding at once, I think is what makes this different than years past in conversations about transportation.
Tariq, let me be clear. Do you disagree with anything that Larken just said? Or are you concerned, and I know you have been concerned about in the past, how all of that gets done? Because you have about 12 layers of government you have got to get through, and multiple stakeholders that sometimes are not always talking to each other.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything Larken just said that I don't wholeheartedly agree with. The opportunity, the timing, the opportunity to unlock federal money, and we know we need transformational investments in how people get moved. Like everything, the devil's in the details, of which, like you mentioned, multiple steps from the towns to the General Assembly to the federal dollars being unlocked to the community actually voting in a referendum to make certain things happen. I mean, all that in the process is really challenging. But for me, it boils down to something even more fundamental than that, which is what's the plan? The plan and how we come to it amongst all those groups are the recipe for success. Too often in the past, it's been a small group of people that have decided behind closed doors what it's going to be, then gone and rebranded and marketed it again. And what we really need is a plan that we can take advantage of and get consensus with all the folks to unlock the transformational investment. And the problem is it's not going to be just a straight up light rail plan with some marketing sprinkled of there's some sidewalks too, right? It's got light rail, as we saw in South End, which you mentioned before, is amazing from an economic development perspective. Look at all the growth and everything that transformed around there. But is it easier to drive around South End today than it was 15 or 20 years ago? The answer is clearly no. So is it a powerful tool? Sure. We are spending money on moving people, and I don't necessarily agree that the formula that got us here is the one that's going to move people 20, 30 years from now.
Larken?
Yeah, it is absolutely going to be a heavy lift. But as someone once said, we don't do these things because they're easy. We do them because they're hard, and it's critically important. So there are a lot of hoops to jump through. There are a lot of conversations that need to be had, and it's going to be difficult, but it's important, and we've got to do the work.
New data that we got this past week shows overall decrease in crime here in Charlotte last year. CMPD says the violent crime in Charlotte dropped by about 7%. Homicides also dropping 18%. And we should say here that Charlotte, one of a few major cities that saw a decrease in homicides last year. That said, Tariq, you have still some concerns.
Yeah, I mean, we always pay way too much attention to one number here, which is homicides. And while rightly so, we should be. But looking at those, we've learned very, very carefully over the last many years that the difference between a homicide and a shooting can be an inch of a bullet. So to not look too deeply into, what those kind of series of fateful events brought into a number, and more into the whole picture of violent crimes in general, but then the property crimes, the rapes, which have gone up, other things like that. And there's also kind of a thematic flow as folks grow into and we lose from the system and they go out there and become criminals. They don't start necessarily with homicides. They start with car break-ins, right? And different things like that ultimately get reported. We see those stats rise, get unchecked, and they flow through a system, a criminal justice system that's broken. So, I mean, this is driving an absolute steamliner, not a speedboat. And while we can look and nod at a little number like that here or there, it should be nothing that gets us comfortable to sit back on our heels.
Finally, Larken, I just want to get your 2 cents on the fact that this all happening, you guys juggling all of this in what is now an election year, originally was not. And Larken, you're running for an at-large seat this coming year. And Tariq, you have so far are undecided?
I have been elusively not answering the question, Ben. I will tell you, I am probably going to do something that I've decided on, and I am also working on something bigger as well around a slate of people to actually, take advantage of what will be a real low turnout race, more than likely, in a, very favorable potential year with a red wave for Republicans. So more to come on that.
Tariq Bokhari for dog catcher 2022.
Tariq Bokhari,
know it. Let's go.
I've got your quote. Probably going to do something I have decided on.
No
okay.
Dogs will be roaming these streets without me knowing in the next election. Right. I guarantee that.
Gentlemen, thank you both for coming on. We appreciate it. More Flashpoint after this.
The Queen's Feast is back and better.